With the stagnant European Union and NATO process in the Balkans, other non-Western actors are positioning their interests in the region, including China. The Balkans encounter geopolitical uncertainty, weak governance, and incomplete access to the European market, which creates opportunities for China to engage in vital sectors. China invested around $35 billion in the Balkan region in 2009 to 2021. The key areas of Beijing's focus are expanding its energy and infrastructure, followed by wider cooperation in society and politics. China interacts with the Western Balkan states on bilateral basis, but also through the 16+1 framework, which includes cooperation from Central and Eastern Europe. 12 out of 17 members of the platform are member states of the EU, and the remaining 5 are candidates or potential candidate countries. In Serbia, Chinese investment reached $20 billion. Beijing favors engaging with elites and high-position office holders, such as in Bosnia-Herzegovina's elite-dominated pillar structure. Kosovo is not part of the 16+1 cooperation structure, since China does not recognize Kosovo as an autonomous state. The gap of Bosnia and Herzegovina to comply with EU law opens up China's investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, which funds infrastructure projects and aims economic and political ties with over 60 countries. In Albania, by March 2020, China was Albania's third largest trading partner. China's rising influence in the Balkan region is increasing geopolitical competition with the West and has led to new emphasis on accelerating EU and NATO integration. What are China's long-term goals in the Balkans and the effects of prolonging EU and NATO accession? And will Balkan countries fall for China's debt trap? My colleague Harun Karcic will cover China's influence in the Balkans with Vladimir Shopov, a visiting fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations.
Mr. Shopov, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans. Gentlemen, thank you so much once again for taking time to speak to us. Now, let's talk about China in the Balkans and in Central and Eastern Europe. China's emergence as a power in the Western Balkans over the last decade is among the most significant geopolitical developments in Europe. First of all, why would a region with a lackluster economy such as that of the Western Balkans be of any interest to a rising world power such as China?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. It's good to be back. Well, actually, there are a couple of reasons why China has wanted to make itself present in the region. One primary reason is, of course, the fact that China has always wanted to enter Europe, and Southeast Europe and the Western Balkans in particular have been a pretty welcoming point of entry in terms of its ability to get a foothold into Europe. Secondly, you will be familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative, and one significant element of that initiative passes via the region. So what that means in practice is that China has wanted to generate influence and position itself in parts of Europe that would facilitate the construction of the Belt and Road Initiative on the European continent. And then, of course, one should never forget the fact that the countries of the Western Balkans are, prospective EU member states. Most of them have already joined NATO. Clearly, finally, the process of EU negotiation and EU accession has been, unblocked, at least partially. So China perceives those countries through this lens. It has adopted a longer-term view and expects to see those countries within the European Union. And finally, I should say, again, it's important to be mindful of the kind of wider diplomatic approach that China has, for instance, in the context of the United Nations. So it has what I call a numbers diplomacy, which means that it wants to have as many partners and as many allies in various international organizations and fora as possible.
Right.
So obviously the countries of the region are important in this respect as well.
Right. But has China already acquired real leverage over Western Balkan countries, or is it on the cusp of doing so?
Well, I think it would be a bit of an exaggeration to say that China has already managed to achieve the kind of leverage that it has wanted and that it has sought, and the kind of leverage that would be able to significantly influence or shift or block any of the kind of, independent foreign or economic policy initiatives that governments of the region might have. Nevertheless, I think we did just have a pretty critical moment just a couple of years ago in the case of Montenegro, where clearly the country was on the cusp, of being quite firmly within the grasp and at the mercy of the ability of Beijing to influence its decision-making process. And of course, I'm referring to the situation of the near bankruptcy that was, created by the enormous loan that the Montenegrin government took upon itself in relation to the construction of that section of the Bar-Boljare motorway. So I would not say that China is on the cusp of exercising effective leverage, but nevertheless we should always be quite aware of the kind of a key political fact, and that is that the countries of the region are in a process of Europeanization, as long as it is and painful and difficult as that may be. So, whenever countries of the region engage and interact with states like China that do present and that do offer a completely different alternative order in terms of institutions, values, etc., I would say that, the governments and societies of the region should be aware of a situation, where these alternative models might be forcefully, implemented in the region, thereby, affecting the independent capacity of the countries to make decisions and, make strategic choices.
Now, right. Now, a couple of years ago, over the last couple of years, the analysts that I spoke to, their counter-argument was that China is only interested in doing business. However, what I noticed is that economic influence slowly begins to morph into political influence. Are you of the same opinion? And how exactly, at what stage does economic influence begin to morph into political influence?
No, I absolutely share that opinion. And actually, if you look more closely at the way in which China has managed to, to penetrate, the countries of the region, it is, in effect, pretty difficult to distinguish between economic and political influence, because some of the major, entry project of Beijing into the region have in fact been conceived, approved and implemented with a high degree of political approval by the relevant authorities at the time. So I would say that while on the surface, of course, one sees mostly, economic projects, economic ideas about development, the actual infrastructure of engagement is very much political in nature and presupposes in many cases, quite non-transparent, corrupt, relationships, which need to be in place in order to, approve such projects and get them going. In addition to that, I would say that the last couple of years we're seeing, slight modification of the strategy of the country. it is beginning to focus more on civil society, on media, on academia. So it is clearly going beyond the political, the economic level of interaction, and is trying to, to create a wider constituency of individuals and institutions with whom to engage in in the countries of the region.
Right. We've seen how China cozied up to Montenegro's former strongman, Milo Djukanovic, whose personalist government collapsed recently. How does China act in such cases when it has invested so much time and effort in co-opting a particular politician? And do you see that China is already beginning to diversify its party ties and approaches?
Well, I would say that the traditional and the preferred approach of China is to deal with incumbents, with the decision makers, influential, powerful politicians who are in place, who have a firm grip of their countries, with whom it is possible to talk, to reach deals and to implement deals. So this is the essential preference and the kind of initial approach that China has. I would say that from this perspective, Southeast Europe and the Western Balkans have been a pretty welcoming terrain for the Chinese, given the fact that we have had some personalistic regimes, which, as you say, are beginning to crumble, but nevertheless have been in place for a pretty long time. When that happens, obviously, Beijing has to be quite flexible. It has to deal with whoever replaces long time incumbents, and the country has been able to do that to some degree in Montenegro. But for example, if you look at North Macedonia, of course, China has had to adopt and position itself in relations to a center-left government, which is slightly more skeptical of ties with the country. So inevitably, as in any kind of diplomatic engagement, China is no exception in this respect. They need to adapt and they need to be flexible. But I would say that they have two maybe ideological preferences. One is that in many cases they do prefer to deal with post-communist, former communist, kind of center-left types of parties. And of course, the second preference that they have is to deal with nationalistic leaders and parties, because these are the ones that have traditionally over the last decade or so been willing to be accommodating to China. And of course, these are countries that open and create more opportunities for China to penetrate into the region. But at the end of the day, they need to be flexible and adapt and start speaking to whoever wins elections.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Shopov, talk us through China's relations with Serbia, perhaps the most developed of all Western Balkan countries. We see that their mutual support for each other's territorial integrity plays an important part in their diplomatic relations.
Of course, you're absolutely right that China's support for Serbia on the question of Kosovo has been pretty central and pretty important to the bilateral relationship. But I would say that there are wider reasons why Belgrade has chosen to create such a strong relationship with China. Of course, one reason is the kind of post-Yugoslav legacy of a more sort of balancing multi-vector foreign policy, which allows the country to work with different partners. Many of those, of course, outside of the West, and we have to appreciate the fact that Serbia and the history of Serbia, certainly after the disintegration of Yugoslavia wars, has been in such a situation where, in a way, such relationships have been necessary for the development of the country. given the fact that it clearly has slightly different and more problematic attitudes towards the European Union, towards NATO. Secondly, of course, I would say that this policy has been put in place during a very specific historical period, and that is the post-2008 global financial crisis period, when the whole narrative and the whole perception of the rise of the East became quite prominent, and of course Serbia not being able to advance quickly towards EU accession, decided to explore the options that were available via this geopolitical and geoeconomic shift. Now, of course, if you ask me, that when that opportunity was always slightly exaggerated, and I think that it is becoming increasingly clear that this is the case. And finally, I would say that there has been an affinity at the individual and the kind of political level, Serbia being essentially a personalistic regime now. Clearly President Vučić has found it easy to work with the top Chinese leadership, strike deals in circumstances which are of course not transparent, that ensure in many cases quick implementation, quick delivery, which is of course a slightly different mode of doing things in comparison to interaction and cooperation with Western institutions. So these are some of the reasons, I think, which do explain, at least partially, the proximity between Serbia and China.
Right. Mr. Shopov, as we slowly wrap up our talk, let's zoom out of the Balkans for a while and look at the Far East. Does Europe understand the consequences and repercussions of a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
I think Europe is increasingly beginning to appreciate the importance of Taiwan. I would say that until maybe a year or so ago, the European Union and most of the big member states within the European Union were not particularly interested in that issue. They were willing to see that as a component of U.S.-China relations. I think that's beginning to change, and partially the reason for that is the entire reconfiguration of the relationships between the West and China in general. So obviously Europe now has to define its position towards Taiwan, towards the possible reactions in cases and scenarios where Beijing decides to invade Taiwan. But I would say that we are still at a pretty early stage of that process. Clearly, the EU itself is now moving in the direction of considering Beijing much more of a rival and competitor than was the case a couple of years ago. And I would also say that lots of European politicians are beginning to appreciate the actual consequences of a potential global political and economic disruption that is linked to Taiwan. And of course, that is in the context of the series of incredible disruptions that we have all witnessed over the last couple of years. And I think finally, Taiwan and support for Taiwan is now increasingly becoming a key element of the relationship between Europe and the US. Again, the attitudes and the support for the US administration for Ukraine, is clearly pointing to a perception and attitude of global politics in which conflicts are interconnected and are difficult to interpret as kind of separate, completely independent of each other phenomena. So the European Union is having to define its position on the issue of Taiwan for that reason as well. So given all this, I think we are on the path of reaching some kind of point of policy point of equilibrium, which is not necessarily going to be a very stable one, but I think is clearly taking us to a much deeper understanding of the situation in the Taiwan Strait, and I think gradually to the conviction that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be just as disruptive to the liberal international order as the Russian war on Ukraine has been.
Right,
so I think this is where we are heading.
Very briefly, I mean, in a number of articles that I came across, I was under the impression that Chinese news agencies and pro-China writers depict the European Union as a victim of US imperialism and as an actor which needs to stick to its own strategic autonomy plans when it comes to defense. Is this their attempt to divide and rule the transatlantic alliance?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, this is a pretty standard kind of tenet of Chinese propaganda. It has been around for quite a long time. I think, strategically speaking, one of the key goals, political goals, geostrategic goals that Beijing has, is the sowing of divisions along as many policy and political lines as possible between the European Union and the US. So there's little surprise there. But as we have seen in the case of Ukraine, I would expect that there will be a lot of disappointment in Beijing, in the sense that I do not really. If anything, I see a convergence of positions within the Euro-Atlantic community.
Right, Mr. Vladimir Shopov, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you once again for your time.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
China's efforts to spread its influence in the Balkans faces limits and preconditions from the West. A Chinese project at the Piraeus airport in Greece encountered a temporary pause decided by Greece's highest administrative court due to an assessment that had not been carried out as required by EU law. Despite inflows of Chinese capital, the EU remains the leading economic partner with 70% of total foreign direct investment and 81% of exports. Beijing also creates conditions for its own policies in the Balkans, lending huge loans with explicit circumstances that may lead to a debt trap. In 2021, Montenegro found itself in such a trap, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of almost 100%, with over half owed to China. Amidst the competition with Western countries and pushing to embed its laws in the Balkans, China also pursues its own long-term goals and maintains its presence.